Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to Brain and Behavior. I am Dr. Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur. This is the eighth week of the course, and this is the last lecture in the course. Today we will talk about social knowledge and social cognition. Now, social knowledge is something very interesting to think about. Basically, it's knowledge about the social situations and the social conventions by which we have to live our lives. So, the idea is how do you get out? How do you meet people? How do you greet people? What is the basic, courtesy, when somebody says, please or thank you, or when do you have to say sorry? When do you have to pay your respects? Uh, Things like that. So social situations and social conventions are in some sense extremely complex, and not only we need to understand the social rules properly, we also need to act according to them. We also need to understand or navigate multiple instances where sometimes these rules are ambiguous, and then we have to decide the best course of behavior. Now, it seems, however, that the human brain is fairly adept at handling these almost confusing social situations, as most of us, unless suffering from specific neurological or psychiatric illnesses, can go about our lives making adequate social interactions and forming lasting social and interpersonal relationships. However, the lack of straightforward social rules is nevertheless a concern, and social neuroscientists have been interested in figuring out the neural systems that would help us take appropriate decisions in situations where the social rules are of little help. According to some contemporary research, the following areas of the brain have a role to play in navigating our social environments, driving our social behaviors. The orbitofrontal cortex. Now, patients with orbitofrontal cortex damage have been found to have the most difficulty when they need to draw on their social knowledge and make sense of their social interactions. For example, Valerie Stone and colleagues developed a social faux pas task that tries to estimate a person's ability to reason about the world. In this task, participants are presented with a series of social scenarios in which one of the character commits a faux pas by accidentally saying something impolite. For instance, one of the stories is of Janet and Anne. Now, Anne has received a vase as a wedding gift from Janet. 1 year later, Anne has forgotten that the vase was gifted by Janet. One day, while at Anne's home, Janet accidentally breaks the vase, and Anne tells Janet not to worry because it was a wedding gift that she never liked anyway. The researchers then measured the social reasoning by asking participants to identify if someone in this interaction has committed a social mistake, and if so, why. Stone and colleagues gave this test to patients with orbitofrontal cortex damage, patients with lateral prefrontal cortex damage, and healthy control participants. In comparison to the other group of participants, those with orbitofrontal damage could not perform well on the task. Hence, they demonstrated a decreased ability to apply their social knowledge to these kind of scenarios. Patients with orbitofrontal damage understood the fact that a character like Janet would feel bad about breaking a vase, but they could not understand that Anne's comment about not liking the vase was actually meant to reassure Janet and not to insult her in any way. These patients were not as able to take the context into account when reasoning about these kinds of social mistakes. This pattern of results suggests that orbitofrontal cortex damage impairs the ability to use social knowledge to reason about social interactions. Now, another set of experiments by Jennifer Beer and colleagues, as we've discussed earlier in the chapter, involved three groups of participants engaging in a structured conversation with a stranger, and it included patients with orbitofrontal damage, with lateral frontal damage, and healthy participants. It was found that patients with orbitofrontal damage were likely to introduce impolite conversation topics even though they were talking to a complete stranger. These patients were apparently unaware that their actual social behavior violated the social rules for conversations with a stranger. Now, such a lack of awareness can be especially problematic as it makes it difficult for the patient with OFC damage to feel embarrassment that would have motivated them to behave differently in the future. Sometimes what happens is in social situations, you commit a mistake, but you immediately get the feedback. If you said something not nice, you will immediately get the feedback from those people around you, and that will cause you to feel embarrassed. And next time, you'll not say something that is impolite, that is, improper or impolite to that particular context. Now, in a separate study, Beer and colleagues, they had patients with they investigated patients with OFC damage, and these patients participated in a task that required them to make up nicknames for an experimenter who they were not familiar with. Now, it's a very awkward situation when you have to do something like this. So, while healthy control participants were careful to come up with flattering nicknames and apologize for having to tease someone that they did not even know so well, patients with OFC damage actually offered unflattering nicknames and announced them in a sing song like voice, typically used for teasing people and people you know well. Moreover, patients with OFC damage were not really embarrassed by this inappropriate behavior and reported feeling especially proud of their behavior. It seems, therefore, that this lack of knowledge about their social mistakes, uh, you know, the in the patients with OFC damage can never generate the emotional feedback that would allow them to change their behavior for future instances. It seems that when they do not have the knowledge about social appropriateness and conventions, they cannot apply this knowledge to their social interactions. Further, these people are less likely to be able to recognize that their behavior is inappropriate and generate any emotional feedback that they would need to check their behavior and change it for the better in the future. Adult patients who sustained OFC damage later in life do retain their social knowledge which they have gained prior to the accident, but they're deficient in learning or picking up any new knowledge about social conventions. Also, patients with OFC damage on the whole display socially inappropriate behavior and cannot apply the social knowledge to specific social interactions. Let's talk about social knowledge and decision making. As said earlier, the ambiguity of social rules makes it important for individuals to be able to make correct decisions about their social behavior so as to be able to avoid any awkward situations or embarrassment. Patients with ventromedial prefrontal cortex damage, VMPFC damage that is, are reported to be rather poor at making social decisions. As part of early research into social decision making, researchers gave several types of gambling tasks to patients with VMPFC damage. It is found that these patients had difficult time making these decisions when the outcome was uncertain. For instance, in the research of fellows in FARA in 2007, they wanted to determine whether this difficulty in decision making was tied to uncertainty or just reflected the general unease in assessing the relative value of the given options. Now, in their experiment, the task was a simple preference judgment task between two options of colors, actors, or food, and it was observed that patients with VMPFC damage were impaired at making these value based decisions, even though there were no uncertainty of outcomes. Another interesting aspect about social decision making is the concept of reversal learning. Reversal learning basically is an ability to learn when a specific stimulus changes its outcome from being rewarding earlier to becoming punishing in the next half of trials. Typically, patients with OFC damage cannot learn from their negative experiences and they go on making the mistake of choosing the same option again and again. So, the idea of reversal learning is also fairly important in social decision making as it can sometimes happen that the same behavior that was once rewarding can turn into unrewarding or even punishing. For example, sometimes one can hug someone and not get the same response back or ends up creating an awkward situation as the hug was neither expected nor appreciated. So, individuals need to take care of this negative feedback and be able to change their future social behavior accordingly. It has been suggested that the VMPFC is involved in coding stimulus value, but it seems odd that people with VMPFC lesions can selectively learn a stimulus value initially, but is unable to learn when the value of a given stimulus is reversed. Now, Wheeler and Fellows investigated whether positive and negative feedback of stimulus value expectation would influence behavior through separate and distinct neural mechanisms. In their experiments, participants were patients with ventromedial prefrontal lobe damage, healthy controls, and patients with dorsolateral frontal damage. Patients were asked to perform in probabilistic learning tasks with positive and negative feedbacks while they were undergoing fMRI scanning. It was observed that the VMF damage selectively disrupted the ability to learn from negative feedback but not from positive feedback. The controls and the DLP damaged patients, however, performed equally well and could learn from both negative and positive feedbacks. This finding therefore suggests two distinct neural mechanisms for learning from the two kinds of feedback. Further, these findings are also consistent with literature that implicates the VMF in reversal learning, extinction, fear conditioning, regret, and envy. However, the findings are inconsistent with an earlier study by fellows that suggested that this region represents relative reward value and preferences. It could be therefore possible that the VMF may carry representations of the expected reward value, not to guide choice per se, but to serve as a benchmark to compare the outcomes against. More specifically, when the outcomes are negative and unexpectedly fail to match the expectation, the VMF enables avoidance learning. Also, it is plausible that this process does not really take place directly but indirectly by signaling to the amygdala and other regions to form a new associative representation that may flexibly change the behavior. So, in cases when the VMF is not functioning, there are no benchmarks to compare against, hence there is no negative feedback to be generated, and therefore no reversal learning can take place. The positive feedback system, however, is intact, and because things are moving as per expectations, learning can take place through positive feedback. If and how this can be extended to social judgments was investigated by Grossman and colleagues in 2010. These researchers specifically wanted to investigate the role of VMPFC in the interpretation of negatively balanced feedback during social decision making. They matched healthy controls with patients who had VMPFC degeneration due to frontotemporal lobar degeneration. These patients were observed to make socially inappropriate comments and engage in socially unaccepted behavior and often show little insight into the effects of these behaviors despite their social consequences. Now, participants were made to judge 20 social situations, for example, cutting into a ticket line at the movie theater, or minor infractions of the law, rolling through a red light at 2 a.m. on a scale of 1 to 5 for social acceptability. These scenarios were then given contingencies that were either negatively biased, let's say rolling through a red light at 2 a.m. when a police car is at the intersection, or positively biased, let's say rolling through a red light at 2 a.m. when rushing a sick child to the emergency room. This time, participants were asked to judge the two randomly presented situations. As for say, should everyone do this all the time? That is a rule-based judgment, or is this generally okay? That's a similarity-based judgment. This manipulation was intended to ferret out differences that could be due to insensitivity to perceived legal and social rules. No difference was observed in the behavior in the performance of FTLD patients, frontotemporal lobar degeneration patients. More specifically, they judged negative scenarios to be more acceptable than the healthy adults judged them to be. When healthy adults judged these negative social scenarios, extensive activation occurred in the VMPFC than when they judged the positive social scenarios. This was the specific region of cortical atrophy in FTLD patients. So, this is the region which is basically helping them learn through these negative social scenarios. So, these studies support the hypothesis that VMPFC plays a crucial role in evaluating the negative consequences of social decision making. Finally, it is also clear that the orbitofrontal cortex plays a strong role in applying social knowledge to our decisions in the social settings and also helps us choose appropriate behavior by supporting reversal learning through evaluation of the negative consequences of the social decisions. So this is about decision and social cognition. Now let's talk a little bit about neuroeconomics. Now, neuroeconomics is an exciting upcoming field that integrates psychology, neuroscience, economics, and computational modeling to yield an understanding of how people make value-based decisions. According to economic models of decision making, people should make rational decisions all the time. That is, they should seek to minimize their losses and maximize their gains. However, researchers have begun to realize that people do not always make rational decisions based on the best financial outcomes. And more recent models, therefore, have started to incorporate the role of emotional reactions that often arise in relation to concerns that are not merely financial. Now, some neuroeconomists have proposed that emotions may sometimes help people make optimal decisions by taking into account a wider range of consequences and are trying to make models that include cognitive and emotional variables driven by valuation of gains, losses, risks, and uncertainties. Let me give you an example. Suppose individuals are given, $50 and a chance to gamble with it. Now, if one has either a guarantee of keeping $20 or a chance to gamble at all, what would be the choice? On the contrary, alternatively, if one has a guarantee of losing $30 or a chance to gamble at all, will the choice be different from the earlier one? Now, most individuals prefer to gamble when faced with a guaranteed loss, even when the monetary consequences of the guaranteed options are the same, as in the two bets here. Now, it seems that the guaranteed emotional response makes people focus on any option that will help avoid the guaranteed loss. People just want to avoid the guaranteed loss and take, some other decision that sort of helps in, gain another outcome. Now, DiMartino and colleagues in 2006 conducted an fMRI study to understand the neural systems that underlie emotion driven and rational decision making in this task. It was found that participants who were misled by the loss frame tended to show activation in the amygdala. Orbitofrontal cortex activation was correlated with rational decision making, and participants who made decisions based on monetary principles showed significantly more orbitofrontal cortex activation than did participants who based their decision on emotions. Now, how are the financial decisions made in the context of interaction with the other person? Let's see. Some research suggests that emotions may lead to decision making that is financially irrational but beneficial for overall social reputation. One study observed decision making using the ultimatum game. Here, one player must split a sum of money with another player, let's say P1 and P2. Now, P1 has to offer a portion of the sum to P2, and P2 must decide whether to accept or reject the offer. The offers may be fair, like 50-50 to both, or it could be slightly unfair, let's say 80-20 or 70-30 split. However, if P2 rejects the offer, neither player would get. In another version of the ultimatum game, an fMRI study was conducted when participants were asked to perform the prisoner's dilemma task. Here, participants have to make decisions about dividing a sum of money. Their winnings depended upon various combinations of their own decision to cooperate or betray their partners and their partner's decision to cooperate or betray with them. The choice of cooperation is also double-edged sword. Participants win if both the players decide to cooperate, but lose if one player decides to cooperate and another tries to betray. So, in this study, cooperation was linked with areas associated with reward states such as the nucleus accumbens, the orbitofrontal cortex, anterior cingulate, and caudate nucleus. The author suggests that this activation reflects a positive emotional experience that reinforces pro social decision making. So, it seems that when you decide to cooperate, these areas of the brain would light up, sort of, and would basically make you feel better about the decision. Also, investigations of the neural system that underlie human prosociality suggest that people experience prosocial acts as intrinsically rewarding. More and more research has demonstrated that reward and subjective value rely on activity in the mesolimbic dopaminergic targets, that is, including the nucleus accumbens and the orbitofrontal cortex. Also, in humans and other animals, activity in these regions strongly correlates with the subjective value of a wide variety of reward types, including primary rewards such as food and juice, and secondary rewards such as monetary gains. Interestingly, even in the absence of direct first person awards, these regions are also activated by pro social outcomes. For example, nucleus accumbens responds robustly when a person is rewarded his money, as well as when that person watches somebody else win a cash reward which he has gained fairly. Such evidence suggests that perceivers experience outcomes for another person to be rewarding in their own right. Also, similar patterns of neural response have been observed when one person agrees with others, suggesting that individuals experience interpersonal consensus as intrinsically rewarding. In both these activations in both these activations were observed even though participants received no immediate reward other than the pro-social outcomes associated with positive social events. So this whole pro-social act already in itself seems to be rewarding. Now let's talk about moral decision making. Now, one of the interesting aspects in social behavior is the need to often make moral decisions. Several interesting questions have been raised in regards to how people make moral decisions. Say, for example, what are the brain areas that are involved, uh, whether moral decisions are based on emotions or cognitive computations, and so on. Moral decision making is typically studied by posing moral or philosophical problems and asking participants to make these decisions while their response times or brain activations are measured. Let's look at a couple of such problems. First is the trolley problem. In this problem, a conductor loses control of his trolley car while you, as the participant, are watching. As witness, you can see that if nothing is done, five people will be likely killed because the trolley they are directly in the path of the speeding trolley. But you have a choice, and you can pull a switch to divert the trolley on another track. This option, however, comes at a cost, one of ensuring the death of a single construction worker who is working on the alternate track. So the dilemma is whether you will pull the switch or not, whether you want to kill one person or let five people die. Another problem is the footbridge dilemma. Here, you are standing next to a large stranger on a footbridge that crosses over the tracks. You see an out of control trolley speeding towards five people. This time, the only way to stop the trolley is to push this large stranger next to you off the footbridge onto the tracks to impede the movement of the trolley car. Now, would you push the person down to the tracks in order to save the other five people? Most participants in such studies agree that while it is acceptable to pull the switch in the trolley dilemma, it is immoral to push the stranger in the footbridge dilemma. Even though, if you see, economically speaking, the outcomes are very similar. Joshua Green and colleagues suggest that we make different choices in the trolley and the footbridge dilemmas because the level of personal involvement in causing the single death differentially engages the emotional decision making. Say, for example, more specifically, you still maintain a distance from the death out of the construction worker because you're just pulling a switch and the death is happening. However, in the footbridge problem, you have to yourself push the person down from the bridge to the tracks, and it's sort of your involvement is a little bit more, you'll feel more responsible for causing the death. Now, Green and colleagues conducted a series of fMRI studies that contrasted moral dilemmas involving high levels of personal engagement with dilemmas involving low levels of personal engagement. It was observed that personal and impersonal dilemmas were associated with distinct patterns of activation. So, impersonal dilemmas were linked with greater activation in the right lateral prefrontal cortex and bilateral parietal lobes, areas associated with working memory. On the other hand, more personal dilemmas engage regions such as the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate gyrus, and the amygdala, which are more about emotional processing. So these regions have also been previously associated with emotional and social cognitive process. We've seen about these regions, in the earlier parts of the lecture. It is therefore established that moral decisions are differentiated to the extent that we allow either emotions to influence our decisions, which is in more personal dilemmas, about what is morally acceptable. So, how closely or how personally you take these moral decisions basically sort of decides how you will make these moral decisions. So, I think we come to the end of the course now. I think for the last 2 weeks of lectures, you have seen that I have basically given you a PowerPoint voiceover. We will, if there is time, record these lectures in the normal format and update it on the website. At the moment, you will just be able to access these PowerPoint voiceovers on the lectures. And I know that the exams have been postponed, so I still see that you can go through all of this material. Send me questions if you have any, and get the chance of participating in the task whenever participating in the test whenever it is possible. Okay, thank you for attending the course. Thank you for paying attention to it, hopefully, and I hope everybody would have learned something from this course. And that's all from me. That's all from this course's end. Thank you so much, and hopefully everybody stays safe from this corona epidemic. Thank you.